In 1951, a graduate student at McGill University named Donald Hebb offered volunteers $20 a day, which was a substantial sum at the time, to lie in a small chamber and do nothing. The chamber was designed to eliminate as much sensory input as possible. Participants wore translucent goggles that admitted diffuse light but no pattern. They wore cardboard cuffs over their hands and forearms to limit tactile sensation. A U-shaped foam pillow around their head masked auditory input. An air conditioner provided continuous white noise. Meals were provided through a gap in the chamber wall. The experiment was expected to run for several weeks. Most participants lasted 2 or 3 days. What happened to them in the chamber disturbed the researchers enough that they published their findings with unusual urgency. Within hours of entering the chamber, participants reported difficulty concentrating. Within a day, they began to experience vivid hallucinations, geometric patterns at first, then elaborate scenes, figures, faces, whole narratives playing out in the visual field without any external stimulus. Some experienced hallucinations in other sensory modalities, hearing voices, feeling things touching their skin. Some developed paranoid ideation. Many reported a profound loss of the sense of self, a dissolution of the feeling of being a coherent person located in a body in a world. Participants were offered the option to listen to a recorded academic talk, content they would normally have found tedious and unremarkable. They requested it eagerly and listened to it repeatedly. The boredom of an academic lecture was preferable to the psychological chaos of sensory deprivation. Hebb's sensory deprivation studies launched a field of research that has now been running for more than 7 decades, and the accumulated findings of that research constitute one of the most important things we know about the nature of the human mind. The mind is not a self-sufficient organ that functions independently of its environment. It is a social and relational organ, one that requires ongoing input from the external world, and specifically from other people, in order to maintain the most basic functions of cognition, perception, identity, and emotional regulation. This is not simply a clinical curiosity. It is a finding about what you are. Let's begin with what the research tells us about what happens to the brain when it is deprived of social input. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago spent 3 decades studying the effects of social isolation and loneliness on human physiology and cognition. His central finding, developed most fully in his 2008 book Loneliness, Human Nature and the Need for Social Connection, written with science journalist William Patrick, is that chronic social isolation produces effects on the human body and brain that are comparable in their severity to the effects of other major health risk factors. Cacioppo's research found that loneliness, defined not as the objective quantity of social contact, but as the subjective experience of insufficient social connection, is associated with elevated levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Chronically lonely people have stress response systems that are operating at a higher baseline level than socially connected people. Their cardiovascular systems show elevated blood pressure and inflammatory markers. Their immune systems show altered patterns of gene expression that suggest a shift toward a more defensive, inflammatory mode of operation, which over time increases the risk of a wide range of chronic diseases. The mechanisms through which social isolation produces these effects involve the brain's threat detection systems. Cacioppo found that lonely people show heightened activation of the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection region, in response to social stimuli. They process neutral social information as more threatening. They are more alert to potential signs of hostility or rejection, and they show reduced activation of regions associated with reward and pleasure in response to positive social interaction. This hypervigilance to threat is, Cacioppo argued, an adaptive response. In the ancestral environment, being isolated from one's group was genuinely dangerous. The individual who responded to isolation by becoming more alert to environmental threats, more cautious in social interactions, more vigilant about potential danger, was more likely to survive long enough to rejoin the group. But in the modern world, this adaptive response has become self-defeating. Lonely people, because of their heightened threat vigilance, interpret ambiguous social signals as hostile or rejecting. They are more likely to withdraw from social interactions that feel risky. This withdrawal reduces opportunities for connection, which perpetuates the isolation, which maintains the heightened threat vigilance, which makes social interaction feel even more threatening, in a cycle that tends to become self-reinforcing over time. Cacioppo's research identified what he called the lonely echo chamber, the way in which the cognitive and physiological changes produced by chronic isolation make it progressively harder to form the social connections that would relieve it. What happens to cognition specifically under conditions of more extreme social deprivation is documented in a body of research on solitary confinement that is as disturbing as any findings in the behavioral sciences. The psychiatrist Stuart Grassian at Harvard Medical School conducted interviews with prisoners held in solitary confinement and published his findings in a 1983 paper that became foundational for understanding the psychological effects of extreme isolation. What Grassian documented was a syndrome he called shoe syndrome, after the special housing units in which solitary confinement prisoners were typically held. The syndrome had a remarkably consistent clinical presentation across individuals who had no prior contact with each other and no knowledge of each other's experiences. The symptoms included hypersensitivity to stimuli, in which ordinary sensory inputs, a door slamming, light changing, another person's voice, became experienced as intensely disturbing and even painful. Perceptual distortions and hallucinations, often beginning with geometric patterns and escalating to complex scenes and figures. Difficulties with thinking and concentration, including what prisoners described as their thoughts becoming fragmented or foggy or impossible to hold together. Intense anxiety, sometimes reaching panic levels, paranoid ideation, impulse control problems, self-harm, and in a significant proportion of cases, a dissolution of the sense of self so profound that prisoners described no longer knowing who they were, no longer feeling like a person, no longer being able to locate themselves in time or in coherent experience. Grassian found that these symptoms appeared typically within days of entering solitary, that they were clearly related to the isolation itself rather than to prior psychological conditions, and that they often remitted when isolation ended. He was also disturbed to find that individuals who had no prior history of psychiatric illness developed severe psychiatric symptoms under these conditions, and that individuals who had been psychiatrically stable for years deteriorated rapidly. The implications for understanding the relationship between social connection and psychological functioning were stark. The mind does not simply prefer social connection. It requires it in order to function. Remove social input, and the cognitive and perceptual machinery begins to malfunction within days. Why should this be true? The answer lies in understanding what the social environment actually provides for the human mind. The cognitive neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has argued, in his 2013 book Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, that the human brain has a dedicated default mode network, a set of brain regions that activates automatically when the brain is not engaged in specific tasks, and that this default network is primarily a social cognition network. When you let your mind wander, it doesn't wander randomly. It thinks about other people. It simulates social scenarios, replays social interactions, imagines future conversations, models the mental states of people you know. The default network is, in Lieberman's account, the mind's idle state, and the content of that idle state is social. The brain, when not directed elsewhere, spontaneously engages in the activity of social thinking. This suggests that social cognition is not simply one among many things the human brain does. It is what the human brain does by default. Remove the external social world that feeds this system, and the system continues operating but without the inputs it needs to function coherently. The hallucinations reported in sensory deprivation and solitary confinement may be the default social cognition network generating social content in the absence of external social reality to process. The psychiatrist Viviane Labrie has proposed that the human experience of self, the coherent sense of being a particular person with a continuous identity, is not something generated entirely from within the individual mind. It is something that is co-constructed in social interaction, maintained through the ongoing experience of being recognized, responded to, and engaged with by other people. In social interaction, you are continuously receiving feedback that confirms your existence as a coherent social agent. Other people respond to your presence, acknowledge your words, react to your actions. This ongoing stream of recognition is part of what maintains the felt sense of being a self. Remove it, and the self begins to destabilize. This is precisely what prisoners in prolonged solitary confinement report, and it is what participants in extended sensory deprivation experiments experience. The dissolution of the sense of self is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a literal description of what happens when the social input that normally contributes to the construction of subjective identity is removed. The research on extreme isolation makes the general case with unusual clarity, but the implications extend far beyond the extreme cases. In 2020, the world was given an unprecedented natural experiment in the effects of reduced social isolation across populations. The COVID-19 pandemic forced many societies into conditions of significantly reduced social contact, and the mental health consequences were rapid and substantial. Research published across multiple countries in the first year of the pandemic found significant increases in rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness across populations, with the effects most pronounced among those who were most socially isolated. The elderly, those who lived alone, those who had lost access to their primary social environments. But even among people who maintained social contact through digital means, who continued to interact through video calls and messaging, the reduction in physical, in-person social contact was associated with measurable declines in psychological well-being. This finding points towards something important about the nature of social contact. Not all social interaction is equivalent. Physical, in-person social interaction has qualities that digital interaction does not replicate. Eye contact, gesture, tone, the synchronization of breathing and movement that occurs between people in physical proximity, the subtle cues of physical presence that the body reads and responds to below conscious awareness. These are not simply aesthetic preferences for the pre-digital mode of interaction. They are components of the social experience that the human nervous system expects, and that their absence is registered as a form of deprivation. The neuroscientist Stephanie Cacioppo, building on her husband John Cacioppo's work after his death in 2018, has begun mapping the neural mechanisms through which physical social interaction regulates the human nervous system in ways that digital interaction does not. The vagal nerve, the primary channel through which the social nervous system communicates between the brain and the body, is responsive to the physical cues of co-presence in ways that have not been replicated by any digital medium. The co-regulation of nervous systems that occurs in physical proximity, the unconscious attunement of physiological states between people in the same room, appears to be a significant component of what social contact actually does for human well-being. The implication is that the quality of the social connection matters enormously. Loneliness is not simply the absence of people, it is the absence of a certain quality of connection. And digital connection, however convenient and however much better than nothing, does not fully replicate what in-person social contact provides. What does all of this mean for how we should think about solitary confinement as a practice? The research is unambiguous. Prolonged solitary confinement causes serious psychological harm to a substantial proportion of those subjected to it, including harm to individuals with no prior psychiatric history, harm that appears to be a direct product of the isolation itself rather than of the individual's prior condition, and harm that in some cases involves the kind of cognitive and perceptual deterioration that constitutes severe psychiatric illness. The American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and a range of other professional bodies have concluded on the basis of this research that prolonged solitary confinement constitutes cruel and unusual treatment and should not be used in correctional settings. More than 120 countries have banned or severely restricted the practice. In the United States, where the practice remains widespread, approximately 80,000 people are held in solitary confinement on any given day. The application of what we know about isolation to the design of social environments more broadly is something that the research has barely begun to address. If social connection is not merely something that human beings prefer, but something they require in order to function cognitively and psychologically, then the design of social environments, the architecture of workplaces, cities, care facilities, digital platforms, educational institutions, becomes a matter of fundamental psychological and public health importance. The loneliness epidemic, documented across multiple surveys in the years before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, is not simply a measure of subjective unhappiness. It is a measure of a population exposed to a chronic deficit of something they need in order to function well, in the same way that nutritional deficiency is a measure of a population exposed to a chronic deficit of something they need in order to maintain physical health. The fundamental thing that all of this research tells us is something both simple and profound. Human beings are not autonomous individuals who can choose how much social connection they need and how much they can do without. They are social organisms, shaped by evolution for life in groups, whose most basic cognitive and psychological functions depend on ongoing social input. The sense of self, the coherence of perception, the regulation of emotional states, the maintenance of cognitive function, all of these are, to a degree that most people have never consciously appreciated, products of the social environment in which they are embedded. Remove that environment, and the human mind does not simply become lonely. It begins to come apart. The implications of that finding are still being worked out, but they start with the recognition that other people are not simply things you choose to have in your life. They are part of what makes you what you are.